There is a generation of British people that doesn't quite fit the story. Not Gen X, though they recognize themselves in that generation's skepticism, its self-reliance, its dry refusal to make a fuss. Not millennials, though they get grouped with them regularly, usually by people applying categories that were designed for the American context and don't map cleanly onto British experience. They exist in a specific narrow band, defined not simply by birth year but by a particular historical moment that shaped them in ways that neither the generation before nor the generation after experienced. If you were born in Britain between 1976 and 1985, researchers call you a Xennial. A microgeneration. And the British version of this experience has a texture that's worth examining carefully, because growing up in Britain during those specific years meant something particular. The tail end of Thatcher. The shift from Major to Blair. The optimism of Cool Britannia followed fairly quickly by the realization that optimism has a shelf life. And underneath all of it, the technological transformation that was about to change everything. Let's start with what defined the Xennial experience everywhere, and then look at what made the British version specifically its own. British Xennial childhoods were analog in a way that is now essentially gone. You knew your friends' phone numbers by heart, not because you made an effort to memorize them, but because memory was the only storage available. When you arranged to meet someone, you were there, because the alternative was leaving them standing somewhere with no way to reach you and no explanation. Plans required commitment not as a social virtue but as a practical necessity. The infrastructure of modern communication, the ability to cancel, to adjust, to send a quick message saying you're 5 minutes away, simply didn't exist. You experienced boredom as a regular feature of childhood. Long school holidays with nothing scheduled. Rainy British summers, and in Britain, the summers are frequently rainy, where the garden was wet and the television offered 4 channels and you had to find something to do with yourself. That boredom was not wasted time. It was the condition in which certain capacities developed: creativity, self-sufficiency, the ability to occupy your own mind without external input. British Xennials learned, often without anyone framing it this way, that they were capable of entertaining themselves. That the resources of their own imagination were sufficient. That silence and stillness were not emergencies. And then the world changed. For British Xennials, the technological transition arrived with a specific cultural soundtrack. It was the era of teletext and CFAX giving way to the internet. Of the first mobile phones, enormous, expensive, status objects that very few people actually had, becoming something ordinary. Of going to the library to use the internet on a slow terminal, waiting for pages to load with the patience of someone who had no alternative, and finding it miraculous anyway. Of ICQ and then MSN Messenger, and the particular British version of the away message, which was typically either very dry or inexplicably profound depending on the person. The shift from Britpop and music on CD to Napster and then iTunes happened during British Xennials' young adulthood. They remember buying singles. They remember saving up for albums. They remember the specific experience of a record shop, Woolworths, Our Price, HMV on Oxford Street, as a place where music had physical presence and purchasing it required a kind of intentionality. And then suddenly music was infinite and free and available at 3 in the morning, and something genuinely important had changed, even if it was hard to say exactly what. Neuroscience helps explain why this transition landed the way it did for this specific group. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for adaptation, complex learning, and the integration of new paradigms, continues developing until approximately the mid-20s. Research published in Nature Neuroscience has established this timeline clearly. British Xennials were in the final, highest plasticity stage of this development precisely when the technological landscape underwent its most comprehensive transformation in human history. They were young enough that the new world felt natural to inhabit. Old enough to remember, with genuine clarity, what came immediately before it. The result is a form of what psychologists call technological bilingualism, fluency in both the analog and digital worlds that neither Gen X nor millennials possess in the same way. British Xennials can be fully present in a face-to-face conversation in a way that people who grew up with smartphones often struggle with, not because they are making a conscious effort, but because they remember at a deep level what presence felt like when it was the only option. They can also navigate new technology without anxiety, because they learned early that new technology is something you figure out rather than something that figures you out. This bilingualism shows up in subtle ways. In the ability to read a physical map and also use Google Maps without either feeling like a compromise. In the comfort with both a long phone call and a voice note. In the capacity to appreciate both a physical book and the convenience of reading on a screen without experiencing the tension between them that some people feel. Both worlds are real. Both have value. The contradiction doesn't need to be resolved. There's a privacy dimension to the British Xennial experience that deserves specific attention. Growing up before documentation meant that your past had a quality of privacy that younger generations simply haven't had. Your adolescent mistakes, and adolescence in Britain, as everywhere, is an extended exercise in mistakes, faded into memory and story rather than being preserved in photographs and posts. The embarrassing haircut, the ill-judged relationship, the night that went wrong in ways you'd rather not have on record, these things happened, were witnessed by a small number of people in your immediate social world, and then became part of the oral tradition of your friendships. Stories that could be edited, embellished, softened, or simply forgotten as time required. Research on autobiographical memory confirms that this is how human memory is designed to function. We are built to edit our past, to retain what serves us, to let the rest fade, to reshape our personal narrative as our understanding of ourselves develops. British Xennials are the last generation to have had an adolescence that worked this way. The last generation whose past was, by default, theirs to manage. That experience shapes how you think about identity, about privacy, about the relationship between who you were and who you've become, in ways that are real even if they are difficult to articulate. Now let's talk about the economic dimension, because for British Xennials, it is inseparable from everything else. The oldest British Xennials entered the workforce during the brief optimism of the late Blair years, when the economy was growing and the mood was expansive and Cool Britannia had faded, but its residue, the sense that things were genuinely getting better, still lingered. The youngest ones graduated into the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, which hit Britain hard and specifically. Graduate unemployment spiked. The professional entry points that previous generations had been able to rely on contracted sharply. People with good degrees and reasonable expectations found themselves in unpaid internships, in jobs far below their qualifications, in a labor market that had simply stopped working the way they'd been told it would. For those in between, the experience varied by field and by circumstance, but the underlying message was consistent. The promises made to this generation about the relationship between effort and outcome were not reliable. The economy could and would rearrange itself without consulting your plans. Stability was something you built yourself, carefully, with contingencies, not something that arrived automatically as the reward for doing the right things. Research on economic hardship during early adulthood consistently finds that this experience leaves lasting psychological traces. Not as conscious anxiety necessarily, but as a background orientation, a vigilance, tendency to maintain reserves, a resistance to assuming that good conditions will continue indefinitely. British Xennials carry this in a specifically British way, quietly, without much complaint, with the kind of pragmatic adaptation that this country has always done reasonably well. They made it work. They found ways through. But they didn't forget what the experience taught them. There's something specific about the British Xennial childhood that's worth dwelling on, because it connects to wider questions about what this generation became. British Xennial children were largely free in ways that would now be considered remarkable. You walked to school alone from a young age. You spent afternoons in parks and streets and on buses without adults knowing your precise location. The freedom was real, and so was the responsibility that came embedded in it. You learned to navigate the world, to make judgments, to handle situations that arose without immediately consulting an adult. British streets, British public transport, British social situations, these were the training ground, and the training was largely unsupervised. This produced a particular kind of practical confidence. Not arrogance, not invulnerability. British Xennials are too aware of how things can go wrong for either of those. But a grounded belief in their own capacity to manage what comes. To assess a situation, make a call, and deal with the outcome. That belief was earned rather than instilled, which is why it tends to be durable. British Xennials also grew up with a relationship to anticipation that the streaming era has made largely obsolete. You waited for things. The next episode of a series, once a week, knowing you'd have to wait 7 days regardless of how the cliffhanger landed. The chart rundown on Sunday afternoon, listening for where your favorite song had moved. The photographs from a holiday, developed at Boots a week after you got home, the images arriving as a kind of delayed re-experience of something you'd already half forgotten. Waiting was structural, not optional. And what sustained waiting builds, the tolerance for deferred gratification, the comfort with process, the understanding that some things take the time they take, is something that British Xennials carry forward in ways they may not fully recognize. Here is what the psychology ultimately says about this generation. British Xennials are people who hold contradictions with remarkable ease. They are independent and collaborative, skeptical and open, digitally fluent and genuinely attached to the analog world they came from, economically cautious and capable of real hope, shaped by a Britain that no longer quite exists and completely functional in the Britain of today. This capacity to hold two different versions of the world simultaneously, to carry the before and the after without either one cancelling the other out, is not confusion. It is a specific kind of cognitive flexibility that develops from a specific kind of experience. Most people don't have it, because most people didn't live through the particular transition that produced it. You grew up in one Britain and learned to live in another. You did it at the age when the brain is most capable of genuine integration rather than mere adaptation. And you came out the other side knowing something that people on either side of you in the generational sequence don't know in the same way. What it actually feels like when the world changes. Not in theory. Not from a distance. But from inside it, while it's happening, while you're still becoming whoever you're going to be. In a country with as long and complicated a history as Britain, a country that has been through more versions of itself than most, that might be exactly the kind of knowledge that matters. If this felt like it was written about you, subscribe to British Mind. We do this every week. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit the join button to become a channel member. It's genuinely appreciated.